Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sue Holden, Executive Director for Earthwatch Europe, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Royal Geographical Society for the annual Earthwatch debate. There are about 1,000 people attending, either here in person or online, so that is a fantastic response, thank you. And I think that demonstrates the importance of the subject that we're going to be debating tonight. So, lots of questions. Earthwatch doesn't have the answers. What we like to do is bring together scientists, practitioners, with stakeholders, with people who manage land, who manage conservation areas, so that we can debate the issues, we can understand what the challenges are, and hopefully, collectively, work on solutions.
There are an enormous number of people, and I suspect you are amongst them in Britain, who would describe themselves as someone who loves wildlife. They never miss anything with David Attenborough on the telly. They will happily spend money on feed for their garden birds and pay an annual subscription to be members of a conservation organisation like the RSPB or the WWT. But how wildlife friendly are we really? Do we, this nation of wildlife lovers, really love wildlife? Or do we only love it when it's compartmentalised in reserves or safely and comfortably visible on our TV screens? How much do we really want deer eating our herbaceous borders? Do we want badgers digging up our lawns, swallows nesting in our porches, and, how dare they, defecating on our front doorsteps? Do we want bats in our belfries? If we find these relatively benign creatures difficult to deal with when faced with the reality of living side by side with them, could we really cope with a wilder Britain, one that once again supports big predators like wolves or lynx, or even the vegetarian, and it is vegetarian, it doesn't eat fish, landscape-changing beaver? Are our demands on land for farming, housing, development too important to us and too important to our economy to allow great tracts of it to simply run wild? Are we prepared, really prepared, to make space for nature? Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Christina Eisenberg. Christina comes from a ranching background and lives in a remote log cabin in northwestern Montana, where grizzly bear and wolf populations outnumber humans.
We need to start with the de-wilding. So this is North America in 1804, at the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and this is La Liberté and Ripple's work. They mapped the ranges of 8 large carnivores in 1804 based on early explorers' records. Now, North America is the New World, so all of this colonization took place much after it happened here in the UK. This is the range of those same species in 2004. These range contractions are entirely attributable to humans killing carnivores. However, if we were to redraw this map today, 10 years after this work was done by La Liberté and Ripple, these ranges would go, I don't know if you could see my laser pointer, they would go about like that. So the rewilding is proceeding like wildfire in North America, and the reason for that is because humans are allowing it. This is T-Rex. This is from the Your Museum of Natural History. I took this image last year when I was giving a talk here on the role of wolves in ecosystems. So we have been afraid of anything with sharp teeth and claws for millennia. And we thought that by ridding ourselves of species we consider threats, we would have a much more prosperous life. And these myths about how dangerous these species are to humans, in reality, they're not very dangerous at all to humans. We're propagated by fairy tales such as Little Red Riding Hood. This is the original first edition woodcut illustration from that book. And there's many definitions for rewilding it. You'll see tonight it means slightly different things sometimes to different people. It's simply allowing ecological processes to resume. This is an illustration from the scientific journal at Oregon State University, Terra, and it's a wolf that holds the whole universe in its mouth. The scientific term for that is trophic cascade. So by preying on a species like an elk, a wolf has the ability to indirectly create habitat for things like songbirds and butterflies because it affects how its preferred prey species eats. And when elk can't stand around acting like lawn ornaments or livestock, they start giving plants a break, and you start getting healthy forests again, and that creates a home for songbirds. So that's a trophic cascade, and that's what I've been studying for the past decade. So what is a keystone species? Originally, the term meant a dominant predator that has a preferred type of prey animal, what it likes to eat beyond everything else. So using wolves as an example, that would be the elk or the red deer in this country. With lynx, it would be the hare. So this relationship causes those cascading effects in food webs called trophic cascades. And when you remove a keystone, well, this is a metaphorical term. The term keystone, it stands for the keystone of a Roman arch, and I think all of you know what happens when you remove that keystone. Arches and ecosystems fall apart. In Europe, the blue area is everywhere that there are wolves today. The green is everywhere that there are not wolves today. So wolves have been protected here since 1992. These nations have taken exception to that protection. The IUCN, the UN's body that governs species recovery, has classified the wolf as a species of least concern. There's currently over 11,000 wolves in the European Union. This is the UK, and the green are all protected areas. We know today that protected areas are not enough for rewilding to occur. You have to deal with agricultural areas and human populations. So rewilding is as much about people as it is about anything else. I'm closing with this slide. This is a museum exhibit on wildness, and they chose to illustrate it with a pair of stuffed wolves. This is from a friend of mine who got a PhD in anthropology, and she found profound irony in this museum exhibit. Thank you.
I wear two hats. One is as an engineer and one is as a biologist. I get to do amazing things with Earthwatch. I get to go and find whales, I get to find turtles, and I get to go to fabulous places off the west coast of Canada or Mexico. And I've been doing that now for a better part of 20 years. So I've been living in that wilderness, and I've had a chance to actually experience what these wildernesses look like. And so I know that wilderness is a messy place. It's a scary place. It's a chaotic place. It is what it says on the tin. It's wild. And then I moved to a more civilized part of the world, shall we say. I come over here, I spent 10 years in Bath, and now I'm in Germany, and I went looking for the closest thing I could find to a marine mammal in my landlocked part of the world. My experience with land use planning, all joking aside, comes from having spent, as I say, 20 years living on the coast of British Columbia, where we got involved in, some of you may know the sort of story of the Great Bear Rainforest. We spent a lot of time, I actually got to draw some of the parkland borders, very proud achievement in life, and got to know what the challenges are and what land use planning is all about from the point of view both of the management, as a stakeholder, and as a scientist. My words that describe the wild wilderness and the aspects of wilderness aren't words that describe the forests of this part of the world particularly well. If you walk through a European forest, you find something that's very managed, very carefully managed, very cleaned up. It's been made safe. Well, this is what our world looks like, right? We've got rivers here. They've been dammed. This is highly modified environments. We've got all of these terraces over here. These are farmers' fields, roads going through them. We are engineering our environment. So we need to treat it in some kind of way, essentially the same way we would deal, in my opinion anyway, the way we would deal with any engineered system. There's a process to this. Engineers have a way of doing things, right? We have a methodology. Slow, plodding, geeky, whatever you want to call an engineer. I'm a dean of engineering. I'm okay with that, right? I design machines to work underwater. Underwater is not a happy place. Electronics and water equals smoke, right? It's not a good thing. We have a method for dealing with challenges like that. What do? First thing we do, identify the system, the challenge. What is it we want to do? That's what we're here tonight to debate. Do we even want to do this? Once we make that decision that we want to do this, that we want to go and rewild, then we need to follow a process. And we need to follow that process, and we need to go through identify what we need to do, right? We need to identify how the system works and understand that system. We need to model it. We need to work with it. We need the science to be able to understand what's going on. First step. Then after that, we need to identify things we can do and how we can do them safely. Try them. Try them in prototype. This is a gray whale about to slime this person. So here we have a gray whale. Fabulous reintroduction, rewilding, if you like, of the North Pacific. What an experiment. These guys just about wiped out in the 1940s. They breed down here and they swim up here into the Bering Sea. What do they eat when they're in the Bering Sea? Well, they eat mud. Well, the shrimp in the mud, right? And so they've been doing that, increasing in population since the 1940s, and then by about 1980, there were 20,000 of them. Early 1990s, we said, hurrah, we've managed to recover the gray whale, we'll take them off the endangered species list and have a big party. 10 years later, somebody went up here and had a look in the Bering Sea to see where the whales were, and they weren't there. Gone. 20,000 whales, missing, AWOL. Where were they? They were along the shore here, around the edges of the Bering Sea, feeding in another habitat. Why? Because when you went to look in here, there was nothing left. That mud, gone. Completely gone. An entire ecosystem the size of the North Sea, in fact, bigger than the North Sea, gone. Why? The gray whales ate it out. They ate their own habitat out of house and home. This beaver likes to build dams. Oops, now I've got flooded problems. It also digs into dikes. In Germany, not a good idea. Right? We don't want to flood the place. So we have some issues, collisions that are happening from these animals. Unexpected consequences of having released animals into the neighboring Netherlands are now affecting Germany. Is it a bad thing? We can debate that. And finally, this guy here. I throw a bird up here. This is a fabulous bird, Lapwing. It's a ground breeding bird. It needs ground, flat, open, grassland, not forest. In some of the lakes around where we are, they've made some new islands out of these gravel pits, and they put these islands out there, and then left them for these guys to breed on. Very, very quickly, those islands get colonized by small trees. And very quickly, we have a whole succession that would, if left unchecked, end up in a tree-covered island. Totally useless for this guy. He needs grass. Or, well, she's the one doing the breeding, sorry. Right? So we have this issue that if we don't control that ecosystem, if we don't actually control a new habitat, these islands didn't exist before, if we don't control that in some way, then we lose the objective we were trying to do. I believe that anything we do in Europe, anything we do in the UK, we need to deal with an engineering process. We need to engineer that environment because we already have. So if we're going to rewild it, we need to do that in a careful, methodical, plodding way. We have the advantage in the UK of being able to do that carefully and think about it. We've got time. We need to expect the unexpected. We need to expect that things are going to go wrong. Engineers do this all the time. They call it a safety factor. We need to be able to say, okay, this has gone too far now. Just like my talk, I've gone over my time. I need to sit down. Thank you very much.
Just by way of an introduction, Kate's already explained a little bit about NFU Scotland. We represent everyone from the smallest crofter to the biggest arable farmer in Scotland, be they tenant or landowner. We are separate, completely separate organisation from NFU, England and Wales, and I think we're in a very good position to represent the views of rural land managers across Scotland. I suppose as by way of an introduction, I would say that we're not against all species reintroduction just in of itself. Really our view is that there are opportunities there. We're positive about increasing the biodiversity. We're positive about the ecotourism potential. We understand why a lot of people are attracted to the idea of rewilding, but we believe this all needs to be done sensitively and incrementally. What does rewilding look like to you? What I'd like you to do is when you feel like we've reached the point where we've rewilded, if you can raise your hand, okay? So brace yourself. First one on the list. This is the small cow wheat. It's quite a nice looking plant. Nobody thus far, surprisingly enough. feels we've rewilded. Perhaps the narrow-headed ant will swing it for you. No? No? We have some of these in Scotland already, so it's about reinforcing that population. The beaver. Gee! This is an all-or-nothing crowd here tonight. We want it all here. The beaver, huge effort being spent by Johnny's organisation along there, establishing the Scottish Beaver Trial in Argyll in the west of Scotland. The lynx. I am surprised. This is an enthusiastic audience here. Really what you came for is this guy. And if you don't have your hand up by now, we have a problem. What this is really saying is rewilding has very quickly become associated and synonymous with charismatic species. That energizes you, but it gives other people concerns, and that's not just farmers and crofters. Because whilst these are undeniably going to deliver public goods, they come at a private cost. There is always a cost to doing this. And that cost is usually, I should say not always, but usually borne privately by some of the people living in some of the most economically fragile parts of the country. But there's something more emotional here that I'd like to talk about. This is a quote from someone in a position of power who should have known better, speaking to a farmer who had lost a lamb to a sea eagle on the west coast of Scotland. And that's not respectful. For some people it may be a statement of fact, but to most farmers and crofters it speaks of cultural imperialism. It's basically saying your world doesn't matter as much as my world. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the path to ruination. There are some people out there, and many of them are on the panel tonight, who will speak in detail about rewilding, and they will consider the pros and the cons, and they'll think it through. But there's an awful lot of other people for whom my analogy is this little child in the sweet shop. What can I have next, Mummy? Give me more. The sugar fix. That's not really a healthy way for us to proceed with rewilding. We need less romance and more pragmatism. Don't say no romance, just a little less. A bit more of that Teutonic approach that William was advocating there. I've really enjoyed my time in London, but I have to say, I think we need fewer debates in London and more discussions in the village halls of this country, because that's where this is going to happen.
Since the cultural shock of environmentalism in the 1970s and the realization of that awful damage wrought by humanity on our natural systems, we have come to treat British nature like a granny. A beloved, interesting, but ailing granny. We cherish her personality, her insights on past times, and enjoy being with her. However, we are also protective of our granny nature. I am a supporter of rewilding because I think our society needs a family of natures that include young and exuberant members, natures which a wider cross-section of our multicultural society will be curious, excited, and challenged to engage with. When I'm out and about in the British countryside, I see people engaging with natures in 21st century ways, mountain biking, paragliding, coast steering, wild swimming, and so forth. I'll put money on seeing drone flying becoming commonplace within the next 10 years. I think of rewilding as a term or a label, like punk or hippie, that signifies an unsettling, a desire and a need to shake up the present and move forward. I see rewilding as an opening, a space of creative thinking and action on future natures. For me, rewilding captures an approach to nature conservation with 4 guiding principles. Restoring trophic levels and an emphasis on ecosystem function, or put simply, reconstructing the food chains. This often involves restoring large mammal assemblages and more controversially, allowing predators back in. Second, and this may be the most difficult principle, is a willingness to accept what we term non-analog species assemblages. By this I mean mixes of species other than those codified in our ecological classifications and hence considered legitimate by law and policy. Rewilding is more relaxed about having badgers, muntjacs, rabbits, buddleia and blackthorn all mixed up, so long as the system is functioning. My third principle is what I term hand-in-pocket management, a willingness to stand back and let natural systems take their own course and determine the future ecology of an area. This will result in dynamic boom and bust reserves that are good for certain species one year and not another. But I say to you, we can see the benefits of the Dutch boom and bust reserves here in the UK. Those of you who are enjoying little egrets, spoonbills, great white egrets, these are partly here because of the boom and bust reserves. They don't just die in the reserve, they fly off. And it's almost like this pumping dispersal. My fourth principle is what George Monbiot called rewilding the self. The idea that in modern society, with all its health and safety regulations, we need unregulated places where people can experience nature with their bodies as well as their minds. That feeling of hairs standing up on your arms, the anxiety of getting lost or coming face to face with a large mammal, places where we feel more alive. For me, rewilding represents a first call for action towards a new vision. What I believe we need is large-scale experimental rewilding projects involving government, university, and enterprise. The Dutch did this nearly 30 years ago, and in the last 10 years, a small number of UK landowners have started their own rewilding experiments. I think it's time we, as a United Kingdom, act more strategically, collectively, and ambitiously in shaping a future nature. As a nation, we have the space for rewilding without upsetting or euthanizing granny nature. Spaces can be found in our post-industrial landscapes, green belts, marginalised agriculture, and uplands. So my message is this: let us create a British nature that's a bit more edgy, unpredictable, and in your face. Dare I say, more spectacular. Let us broaden our nature conservation investment portfolio to include higher risk, higher return conservation assets. Thank you.
The United Nations estimate that there'll be 9.6 billion people on the Earth by 2050. In the UK, the population is predicted to reach well over 70 million, by that time putting extra pressure on our already stressed natural ecosystems. Perhaps, and I say perhaps for a number of reasons. The growth in population is likely to be very uneven across the world. Africa's population will more than double, for example, while in European countries we may see a fall. Currently, globally, 54% of people live in urban areas. By 2050, this will be 66%. So whilst the world's population is growing steadily, the rural population may drop in many areas, leading to land abandonment. The other big, potentially game-changing trend is the emergence of so-called sustainable intensification in food production systems. Now, I say food production systems rather than agriculture, as whether we like it or not, the boom in smart mechanization, new techniques for growing protein, and the application of synthetic biology could render many of our traditional agricultural systems economically marginal, even with the current levels of high and highly distorting rates of public subsidies paid to farmers. These trends are critical to understand in any debate on rewilding. People have used the land for food production, hunting, foraging for centuries on almost every corner of Earth. We may now be facing the prospect that a combination of urbanization and technology will start to reverse this trend, and indeed, we saw from Christina that this is actually happening in parts of Northern America. The rationale for rewilding cuts to the heart of why the nature conservation movement exists in the first place. Many, but not all humans, have an empathy with nature. They inherently feel a sense of responsibility to care for other species for their intrinsic value. It remains a moot point as to whether this is a truly altruistic act or whether our deeper motivation is to receive some spiritual or psychological benefit from doing so. And if biophilia exists, then perhaps we're all genetically hardwired to respect nature anyway. But what about those in our tribes that don't much care for nature? those will happily destroy a species or a habitat for personal gain. The uncomfortable truth is that we are those people. 99% of those in the audience today will have a mobile phone in their pockets. Thankfully, they're all switched off, with metals mined out of large holes in the ground by Glencore or Rio Tinto or BHP Billiton or one of the other mega mining companies. Quite a few of us here eat red meat more times in a week than is probably good for our own health, never mind the health of the planet. Now, if we find it hard to change, how can we persuade the average minister in government, dreaming every night about how to grow GDP, to create the conditions for rewilding to become a reality? The fact is, to have any chance of seeing rewilding happen on the scale required to reverse biodiversity loss, we need to marshal other arguments. This means spelling out the full gamut of benefits that will come from rewilding. For example, in those areas where farming is economically marginal, we need to provide opportunities for farmers to diversify into new businesses based on ecotourism and other enterprises, perhaps using some of the 3.5 billion euros provided to farmers in the UK every year under the Common Agricultural Policy. So what about the how? How should we go about rewilding, and what or could rewilded landscapes look like? The Scottish Wildlife Trust's vision is for healthy, resilient ecosystems across large areas of Scotland's land and seas. That's enshrined in our vision statement, which we wrote 10 years ago. This is effectively a rewilding vision, although I appreciate that definitions of the term do vary considerably, and we'll probably pick that up in the panel discussion. As a trust, we are already putting this vision into action through our Living Landscape projects, the largest of which is the Coic Ascent Living Landscape Programme, or CALL for short, a 50-year partnership project in northwest Scotland to restore the ecosystem health of the area, but equally as importantly, to generate socio-economic benefits for the local communities. One of the indicators of the success of this project is whether the local schools are still open and alive with children in 50 years' time. Wood pasture is one of our rarest and our richest habitats in the UK, and it's nothing if not anthropogenic. It might or perhaps should include hunting and fishing. The trick to bringing people with us, and we're going to need to do that if we're going to realize this rewilding vision, is to combine ecological recovery with economic vitality in rural areas. It can be done, and even urban areas actually. It can be done. Indeed, we've made a pretty good start. The challenge now is scaling it up. So once again, we see Atlantic woodlands stretching uninterrupted from the Mull of Kintyre to Sandwood Bay, or the drained and horribly conifer-scarred flow country of Caithness and Sutherland return to its rightful place as the great boggy wilderness of northern Britain. And I'll end there just to say thank you. And by the way, you don't have to live in Scotland to become a member of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. You can.
Can I just ask very quickly, Andrew, you know, there are farming communities all over the world that do farm livestock alongside big predators. I've worked with many of them, and they manage it by understanding the wildlife, they're understanding the foe, if you like, and some of them will even understand that having big predators as part of their ecosystem can be an advantage to the way that they farm. I mean, can you not see a way that farmers could adapt in the future to allow them to work alongside predators? Is it just farmers being a bit stuck in their ways?
We already have that situation where farmers are having to adapt. That exists in the west coast of Scotland with the seagull population that's there. They're having to deal with that. It exists in Tayside, where an illegally released beaver population is now numbering probably close to 200. Farmers are already adapting to it. They're not necessarily happy about how that situation, particularly the Tayside one, but even if you look back to the seagull, the early stage of the seagull one, they're not happy about having got to that point, but they are dealing with it. I think it's not about saying that they can't countenance living alongside these creatures. I think they can, provided certain safeguards are put in place. And nobody's yet been willing to give them those long-term assurances.
I was really interested, though, also in this idea of public goods at private cost, and this idea that predators out there will cause a cost to farmers. Well, for me, I thought that as I understood it, a good mechanism to deal with that was insurance. That it'll be another risk to farming, and it can be dealt with through insurance, and it'd probably be quite a low insurance premium.
You should talk to the NFU about that. Farming insurance is horrendous.
But come on, what is the risk?
Public liability
what
insurance
would the
is even
risk
worse.
of getting your sheep killed by a wolf be? I think your add-on would be quite low for that.
You're not dealing with a rational approach when you're looking at your insurance ideas. I mean, insurance companies are anything but rational, and risk perception like that.
The issue in living peacefully with these large carnivores is you have to realize that they're bigger and stronger than you are, and lose your arrogance as a species and live more on their terms. That's a lot simpler to do than most people think.
Let's open it up to you. Has anybody got any questions for our panel? This gentleman has said that we're talking about reintroducing species that were once endemic in the UK, but in the face of our changing climate, should we be thinking of reintroducing perhaps more exotic species?
Yeah, I mean, I've been quite fortunate to spend the last 24 hours with most of the people on the panel debating these issues in a lot of detail. And I think there's a bit of a developing joke going between us all. It depends. You can't make sweeping statements. What is the species and where are you going to put it?
I'm not sure about that. I think the way the pitch I'd like to put is, why don't we reintroduce a form of a species which we've lost from the UK, which is the opportunity for people in the UK to know cattle and horses as the social herd animal which they actually are. We've had that extinction of that experience for goodness knows how long. And your point on climate change, there is some work from Russia that maybe if we have these large herbivores, they do create something of a buffer against climate change. Because as it gets warmer, the grass grows more and they eat it down, there's more biomass, and as it gets colder. So they act as something of a buffer.
In answer to your question is, we're already doing that. And that's the problem. We're introducing very large numbers of species into this environment pretty much every day. And if you look at introduced species and what happens when you start playing that game, you're not rewilding something. Now what are you doing? You're wilding it. You're adding in a species, an introduced species into something, and you can drag examples from all over the planet where, again, coming back to the same idea, you've got a very carefully organized, very carefully balanced environment, which has either been done by nature or it's been done by human involvement. And then you start adding in new species. If you're going to add in ones that are known to be part of that environment, that were part of it, that's one kettle of fish, if you like. But the other introduction of species in the marine world, in the rivers, think of the zebra mussels, think of any of the purple loosestrife, think of any of the introduced plants that have caused major change in environments because they got out of control. And so you've got this balanced system. At the moment, we don't have predators in this one, right? The big predators. We got some, we got little ones that are able to keep that system going. But if you start introducing an animal who doesn't have a predator at all, or introduce a plant that doesn't have any kind of control, whether it's a parasitoid or something else, you then run into a situation where that'll get out of control.
So I conclude that most of us have spent most of our lives, especially in this country, living in a world where what conservation was about was, understandably, holding the line. Let us, for Pete's sake, stop things getting worse. I think when we start talking about rewilding sensu stricto, when we start talking about restoring processes to ecosystems and perhaps reintroducing some species that have been lost recently, we're doing something rather more radical and rather more exciting. We're saying, let's not just hold the line. Let's look now to a time where we try to push back and recreate aspects of natural processes in recreated aspects of wilderness in a managed sense, that would have been possibly a dream that would be scarcely beyond reach 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think it is within reach today, politically within reach, culturally and socially within reach. But a summarizer has another duty, and that is prolific thanks all around the place. The panel has been wonderful. The chairman has been similarly wonderful. The audience has, of course, been Great. Of course, above all, as people have said already, none of this would have happened without the tireless work of the Earthwatch team. Thanks on your behalf to them, and similarly, none of it would have happened, as always in life, without the sponsors, in particular Mitsubishi, so thanks to them.